Welcome to the video where we will discuss the Crucible and the Dressmaker revision. Today, we will discuss the ideas, concepts and themes that you will need to know to present a satisfactory comparative outcome. But first, let's go over some text knowledge and background for each of the texts. Starting with Arthur Miller's The Crucible. This text is an allegory for McCarthyism. During the time in which Arthur Miller wrote this text, the world was recovering from World War II, and many in the US had a fear for communism. In the US, there were some requirements for individuals who had links to communism to name names. Arthur Miller was one of the people called before a tribunal to name names. We can see some of these ideas replicated throughout the text. So through the Salem witch trials, we see innocent people accused of sin without evidence. And these people have very little power to rebel against the authoritarian regime. It leads to a culture of scapegoating as individuals seek to avoid blame, but also have the opportunity to improve their social standing through the acquisition of land by accusing others. Our tragic hero, John Proctor, sacrifices his own life, trying to bring light to the injustice suffered, particularly his wife, Elizabeth Proctor. Highlighting the impact of the Puritan belief system and the theocratic governance, this text showcases a strict and deeply religious way of life with extremely conservative and traditional values. Essentially, this is a society where the state protects the church through combined law and beliefs. As such, with the church and the state working together, there is very little opportunity for people such as John Proctor to essentially overcome injustice. As part of the outcome, you will be required to compare and contrast the Crucible with Rosalie Ham's The Dressmaker. You will also need to present adequate text knowledge and background on both texts. It must be a balanced approach. If you feel more comfortable with one text than the other, you will need to familiarise yourself with the other text in order to prepare a good response. The Dressmaker, set in 1950s rural Australia, reflects an era where small towns had their own social codes. The town of Dungata is a physically isolated community in a time where Australia as a whole was still very much isolated from the rest of the world. Throughout this text, we see the role of women, feminism and fashion explored, particularly through the lens of progressive protagonist Tilly Dunnage, whose music, books, and haute couture exposes the women of Dungata to something new. However, this Gothic novel has a sinister undertone that critiques the impact of rumours and unjust condemnation. In Dungata, there is a clear class system and a social stigma that surrounds Tilly and her mother, Molly. Overall, this type of society leads to very tragic consequences for many of the townspeople. As I said, today we are going to focus on the ideas, issues and themes represented by both texts. There are many different ideas that you can see on the screen here. We do not have time to cover them all. However, some of them also interlink together. Today, we will focus on guilt and shame, violence. We'll look at social status and also repressive communities. As I said, many of these other themes will overlap with the content covered today. But just to give you a few ideas, this is a slide that you can come back to in order to refocus when you are comparing and contrasting. Let's start with guilt and shame. An overview of this theme. So at the centre of both texts are protagonists who feel a sense of guilt and a sense of shame. Characters throughout this text essentially show that you must overcome guilt and shame or be destroyed by it. When looking at a theme, we can also consider, where does this appear in the text? What examples can I use? So pause for a second and consider, who feels guilt and shame in both of these texts? Or who should feel guilt and shame? Over on the right-hand side are a series of quotes that may assist you in prompting some thoughts. We can see quotes here from John and Elizabeth Proctor, where they talk about John's affair with Abigail Williams, clearly a main source of his guilt and shame. There are also multiple quotes from the Dressmaker, most relating to Tilly Dunnage and the kind of penance that she has had to pay for a crime that she did not commit. Let's have a look in more detail. It's important when you are discussing a theme that you can delve deeper into this theme. Today we are going to look at the types of guilt and the different responses a person may have. There are two types of guilt that I'm going to talk about today. The first one is natural guilt. Now, this is an immediate and normal feeling when you have done something wrong. Generally, this absolves when you fix or remedy the situation. Contrastingly, there is toxic guilt. Now, this is a guilt that festers and lasts. It is a continual feeling. We can see there just by the word toxic that this is not a healthy emotion to express. We can also look at the different responses to guilt. So different characters throughout our text respond in very different ways to the feelings of guilt and shame that they hold. One way may be to repress. So they push those feelings deep inside themselves. They try to smother them and refuse to deal with them. We can obviously tell that that is going to lead to a very eruptive event at some point. Another way to deal with guilt is to share your guilt, is to expose or confide in somebody else as a way of finding release, which is obviously a much more healthy response than repression. But remember, guilt and shame are complex things. It is not always that easy to turn around and share something that you do not feel your best about. Another response is attacking. So sometimes people who are manifesting their own guilt and shame in turn lash out at others around them. Either knowingly or unknowingly they do this. It can also lead to a form of self-harm. Now, neither of these texts are we looking at a physical form of self-harm, however, an emotional form of self-harm where you essentially torture yourself internally for the things that you have done. Let's have a look at our two protagonists. Firstly, we have Tilly Dunnage in The Dressmaker. What is the catalyst for her guilt? What is the thing that forces her to feel this emotion? Essentially, she is blamed for Stuart Pettyman's death, and she certainly introspectively feels guilt for the death of everybody around her. This is a form of existential guilt. Essentially, she carries this unjustly. In addition, Tilly responds by repressing her guilt. Many times she talks about forcing it deep inside of her, and she punishes herself. Even once she returns to Dungata, she does not feel that she belongs, and this stems from her guilt surrounding Stuart's death. What is the outcome of this? Well, she forgives herself after talking with her mother. We know across the course of the text she has moments where she shares her guilt and that different people are able to comfort her. Molly, Teddy, even at the school that she was sent away to when she was young, she does disclose and find comfort in the arms of others. However, Tilly then burns down the town and leaves. We can see here that this toxic guilt has built up into an attacking force. So it's not just a black and white thing, guilt or shame, and that it can manifest and change over the course of time. We can compare and contrast Tilly with John Proctor. Remember, they are not the same, but some elements of them are similar. They both feel guilt, yes, but Proctor's guilt catalyst is a little bit different. Proctor has a feeling of natural guilt due to the adultery that he has committed. And ultimately, he is the reason for Elizabeth's accusation. He does explain both toxic and natural guilt. At some times, he festers and tries to repress this guilt. At other times, it's quite a natural guilt that he feels shameful for his actions. In response, at times, John verbally attacks people around him. He's short with Elizabeth, and definitely when he goes to the court to try to save his wife and friends, he exposes himself and then is so overcome that he is very attacking. He also self-judges and therefore internally harms himself. Ultimately, John is hung since he forgives himself and therefore he chooses to hang rather than to lose his good name. It's important to note again that Tilly and John are similar characters, but they are not the same. They differ in their responses, in that John is able to accept his guilt and to go to the gallows as a good man, whereas Tilly still gets her fiery revenge on all of those around her. Now, guilt can be overlapped with punishment in the text. At the end of both texts, a range of characters are punished, and some are rewarded for their actions or their inactions, or their various attitudes throughout the narrative. It's important that you try to widen your text knowledge, that you are able to give examples beyond the protagonist of this text. There are some pictures around that you may be able to identify, but also included in the table are people who are punished and rewarded. Let's take a closer look at Reverend Hale and his guilt and shame in the text. We see from this image that there is a shadowy depiction in the background. We see the people being hung in the background, nooses around their neck. At the forefront is Reverend Hale, dressed in his ministerial robes. It's important to note that this is a man who changes over the course of the text. Just like our protagonist, he is complex. So try to reflect these in your analysis of Reverend Hale. So Reverend Hale of Beverley initially enters Salem bearing the gifts of high religion and is determined to expose the devil in the town. Throughout the course of the play, he believes that witchcraft is occurring and that the court was just in the execution of those accused. Hale was predominantly involved in the signing away of the soul of Rebecca Nurse, even though she appeared a Christian woman. It is clear that he has always believed in the sanctity of life. Even at the point that he condemns Rebecca, his hand shook signing the death warrant. This is where we see the transformation. Hale punishes himself in the end when he realizes that Abigail and the girls were a fraud, and he was in part responsible for the deaths of innocent people. This was exemplified through the metaphorical blood on his head and statements of remorse stating where he had turned a blind eye of his faith, blood had come up. Ultimately, it is this bloody symbol that highlights Hale's internal punishment. So Hale's a great alternate example that you can use in one of your essays. Another character to consider would be Sgt Farah and his role in the text. Again, we don't really want to make these character-based essays, but sometimes it's easy to think of who and then come back to those big ideas. So taking a look at Sgt Farah, why is he punished? When we look at this character, my immediate sense is, well, he's been a friend to Tilly. He appreciated her work and talent as a dressmaker. He also felt comfortable enough with her to share his secret as a cross-dresser. He mourned with her after Molly died, and he openly criticised the town's treatment of Tilly and Molly in his eulogy at Teddy's funeral, and then reiterated this again at Molly's funeral. So why is he punished? Through reading the text, we can tell that there is a background to Sgt Farah and Tilly's relationship, that guilt and shame, and also punishment and retribution, is sometimes not immediate. He put Tilly on the bus out of Dungatar when Evan ordered she be exiled after Stuart's death. In addition, he assumed someone else was looking after Molly all the years that Tilly was away, which we know was Irma Almanac. Also in the present day, despite being Tilly's friend in private, he also participated in the Macbeth play at the end of the novel, showing that he still is in some ways connected to the guilty townspeople. We know that Tilly openly punishes Sgt Farah at the end. She burns down his beautiful frocks, just like everybody else in the town. So it's important to consider that over time, guilt and shame, punishment and retribution can of course change, adapt, or even manifest over time. You will be required to write on each of these texts. So it's important that while we discuss these ideas here, that you are able to put these into a well-constructed comparative paragraph. Here's an example. The topic originally was, "We are punished in many ways by our guilt and shame." Compare the two texts and how they present this idea. I have another video which discusses how to write comparatively. So if you need to go back and have a look at that, feel free to do so. Today we're going to talk about how ideas are represented in these paragraphs and some key features that you can use to really make the ideas, the concepts and the themes stand out. Let's read. Throughout both texts, guilt is demonstrated to be a debilitating force that can often lead to unhappiness and suffering under certain circumstances. So it's important that you have theme or idea-based topic sentences for your paragraphs. Don't list the characters. Don't tell me about an event in particular. You want to use this spot to really focus your assessor on the fact that you understand a key idea. Then you can move on to give your evidence. So in The Dressmaker, Tilly Dunnage is a prime example of someone who suffers from momentous guilt resulting from her belief that she is cursed. This stems from the town's belief that she murdered Stuart Pettyman when she was a child. Tilly continuously believes that she carries around the weight of the evil inside her, condemning her to anguish where she tries to distance herself from people that care about her. Through Teddy's relationship with Tilly, where she constantly claims that she can't stay or answers firmly and repeatedly no to Teddy's efforts, Ham explicitly proves that past shames can catalyse tribulation among individuals in environments where they are forced to believe that they are not good enough. We can see here by some of the highlighting that this writer keeps coming back to the beliefs or what the director or the writer intends. So it's important that you do the same thing. What values or idea is Ham trying to show? what values or ideas do the townspeople progressively show? Then you want to compare and contrast this with the second example. Remembering things aren't the same, they are similar, and it's important that we look at the differences. So in the Crucible, a direct parallel can be drawn to the compunctious John Proctor and his sins of adultery, which prompts the breakdown of his family. However, Tilly's guilt manifests from a place of self-despise, whereas John, despite hating himself for his actions, forms his guilt in the place of betrayal against his family and religion. See how there's a lot of comparison happening here. This idea is shown in one text in this way, it's kind of the same in this way, and it's different in this way. Miller potentially elucidates that John's dishonourable actions with Abigail brings much inner turmoil, where John feels as though he must wipe his affairs out of mind. Furthermore, John's guilt is amplified when his actions result in the imprisonment of his wife, as John realises that Abigail's desire to replace Elizabeth may have derived from John's reputing of his commandments, and he falls into a place of hurt and anger with his only plan to save his wife. Ergo, both texts delineate the role of moral culpability in suffering and anguish. So this is a good paragraph in the terms of we don't hear the words guilt and shame, guilt and shame, guilt and shame. The writer of this paragraph uses other synonyms in order to describe these ideas. So inner turmoil, moral culpability, all of this is really important because it shows that you have a deeper understanding of this idea. You can use this as an example to draw language if you need. Violence. So violence is a symptom of a bitter and hateful society. Both the Crucible and the Dressmaker are violent stories with violent ends. In both texts, violence is a manifestation of the profound and often repressed emotions within characters. The amount of violence in both texts demonstrates the impact of repressive worlds. So in order to discuss this topic, it's important to note there are different types of violence. We can talk about physical violence, sexual violence, or emotional violence, all of which are shown throughout these texts. We can also look at the different causes of violence. So what forces people to act in a certain way? Sometimes violence is a physical outlet for extreme emotions, anger, frustration, sadness, and at times also shame. Hiding secrets is one of the main reasons that people in each of these texts are violent. Sometimes people are violent in an attempt to overcome feelings of inferiority or lack of self-worth. They like that feeling of having power over others, and as such, they act in a violent way. Similarly, the idea of wanting to maintain power can force a person to become violent. Lastly, at times the influence of violence is culturally normal. So a progressive cycle of when violence has been happening to you for a prolonged period of time and to people around you, that it seems natural for you to continue that dangerous cycle. Here are some examples for you to refer to about violence in the Crucible. There are quotes on the left-hand side to help you give the evidence you need in your writing. Without going into too much detail, in Act 1, the girls are afraid of being whipped. Tituba is threatened with violence in order to get a confession out of her. Abigail hits Betty to wake her and threatens the others with death. And Putnam calls for the death of witches. We see in this opening scene alone that there is both physical and emotional violence. The characters are all fearful of physical punishment, and as such, they act to conceal their sins. Moreover, Abby uses emotional abuse to control the younger girls and have them do her bidding. This continues throughout the play. We see in Act 2 that John Proctor threatens the young Mary Warren with violence when she goes to the courts against his wishes. John uses this physical violence as a way of controlling his household, and this was generally acceptable during this era. So it's important to keep looking through the lens of time here. What is no longer acceptable in today's society was unfortunately acceptable during this time period. In a similar way, Danforth and the courts use hanging as a form of capital punishment, which is no longer used here in modern society. But essentially, the townspeople must either confess or die. The townspeople are fueled by fear of death, and many of them confess to crimes that they do not commit. It is a physically brutal way of enforcing punishment, but also a form of emotional manipulation. You have to remember that many of these people are deeply religious, so confessing to compacting with the devil when they have not. To some of them, this is emotional torture. Lastly, and probably most disturbingly, Giles Corey is pressed to death for refusing to name names. We can suddenly see that link back to McCarthyism that we were talking about earlier with Arthur Miller. So Giles suffers the most confronting and violent death of any of the characters in either text. It shows the brutality of the courts, and of Danforth in particular, that they would torture an innocent man to death in pursuit of fictional happenings of the devil. Any of these examples are great, remembering that when you can talk beyond the scope of the protagonist, you should. You'll also need examples from the Dressmaker. Remember, you have to have that balance to your essay. You can't just rely on your knowledge of the Crucible. There are matching quotes on the right-hand side, again to give you evidence when you discuss this in your essay. Quickly whipping through these events. So Irma is abused for years by her husband in a form of domestic violence. We see Beulah, the town gossip who wanted the McSweeney children punished, despite the lack of evidence. Marigold Petterman is essentially raped by her husband. And Molly also self-harms as a means of punishing Tilly. In Tilly's early life, we see the school children bully her. Ellsworth slaps Mona. Molly lashes out at Evan after Stuart's death. Tilly tries to hurt Mr. Almanac when he leaves Molly to die. Marigold murders Evan. The very frustrated William Beaumont slaps Mad Trudy, and Trudy kicks that bus when she can no longer be Lady Macbeth. When we look at these examples, we can see a clear pattern of cyclical violence throughout Dungata. From when these children were young, there was a lot of violence in this town. People hurting other people to keep their secrets. And this has continued over a time period of decades. So it's important to note that while these are good examples, they shouldn't be seen in isolation. They're all connected. It's about a community experiencing ongoing violence. As I said, to do really well in this topic, you'll need to compare and contrast. So here are some examples that you can talk about, but also some discussion that you can have. When we talk about the types of violence in this text, well, both texts include physical violence. In the Crucible, characters are pulled into social order and forced to conform to social values with threats of whipping. In the Dressmaker, other acts of violence are evident as well, such as the way the townspeople hound Molly and Tilly after Teddy's death. So that physical violence is quite similar, but you'll need to contrast with a difference in the same breath. So the Dressmaker's sexual and emotional violence far outweighs the Crucible's. The sexual violence exemplified by Stuart and Evan Pettyman in particular is concerning and disgusting. While the graphic deaths in the Crucible are also terrible, The level of sexual violence is not seen in the Crucible. Also, when looking closely at the people who are violent, in both texts we see men who are violent towards women, but also people who are powerful abuse people who are powerless. For example, Evan Pettyman drugs and rapes his wife Marigold with no consideration for her rights. His despicable treatment stems beyond his household and is inflicted upon many women in Dungata. We can in some ways see this in the Crucible, where John Proctor rules his household with an iron fist and uses violence against Mary Warren. It's important to note the difference. There are women in each text who show violence, but the response is very different. For example, Tilly lashes out after years of ongoing abuse, whereas Abigail reacts impulsively to cover her personal sins and to continue her brief affair with the now disinterested Proctor after a momentary hurt. So see how we can always look for that minor difference within a similarity. Importantly, in moving to the next level, we can analyse the factors and the causes of violence in this text. To reach a really high result, you'll need to start thinking in this manner. So in both texts, violence stems from emotional hurt. People lash out due to their angry feelings and their repressed emotions. In addition, the keeping of secrets also leads to violence. There are affairs and forbidden loves. For instance, Evan and Molly, Teddy and Tilly, and John and Abigail. While these are all affairs or forbidden loves, it's important to see that there are differences in them as well. Looking at some of these differences, so in the Dressmaker, violence and poor treatment is culturally normal. The way that Evan treats his mistress Molly seems to be something that continues over the course of time. While in the Crucible, violence manifests in response to a particular incident. So the violence stemming from the accusations of witchcraft seem to be the first happenings in the town. Obviously, again, fueled by the John and Abigail relationship. Once again, you'll need to be able to write on these texts effectively. Here's an example of an essay topic with some planning and a sample introduction. Let's go through some of the key features together. The topic is compare and contrast how bitter societies lead to violence in the Crucible and the Dressmaker. The planning is on the left. Highlighted are the topic sentences for each of the 3 paragraphs. This student has broken it down into paragraph 1. Judgment and expectation in small, unhealthy communities leads to horrific and dangerous consequences. Paragraph 2. Secrets in an insular community lead to violent acts. And lastly, those exposed to violence are likely to continue a cycle of brutality and horror due to the confined nature of these experiences. I'm highlighting these 3 ideas because it's very important to include them in the introduction. You don't want your introduction to be sample-based. Okay, you don't want to go, this happened in Dungata and this happened in the Crucible and John did this or Tilly did that. This is a place, once again, to showcase that you understand the ideas, the concepts, and the themes. Let's go through the sample introduction. The Crucible and the Dressmaker scrutinise that individuals in primitive communities often maltreat the vulnerable in order to protect themselves and their malicious ideologies. Great. We have an opening theme sentence that discusses the major issues in both texts. Then you can move on to discuss each text individually. Arthur Miller's allegorical interpretation of the 1692 Salem witch trials explores the impact of religion, faith, and power on critical decision-makings through the eyes of tragic hero John Proctor. Set against the backdrop of Puritan Massachusetts, the play investigates the intricacies of human nature, meanwhile elucidating that true justice is gravely difficult to achieve. See again, even though they're telling us what happened in the text, they're doing it through the lens of what this text is about overall. Religion, faith, power, human nature. Let's look at the dressmaker. So in juxtaposition, just a fancy word for comparison, Rosalie Ham's fictional novel, The Dressmaker, adopts a Gothic style, offering extreme depictions of the vulgarity of some of the odious people and further delineates the deserving repercussions of behaviour exemplified through the abuse suffered by protagonist Tilly Dunnage. Then I have my contention. So Miller and Ham convey that some individuals with greater moral culpabilities can use their power for good under theocratic environments, while for some, bitterness reigns. Now you get to put your 3 ideas. What's going to be discussed in these 3 paragraphs? Don't give me the examples. Save them for later. Just tell me what the big ideas are. Both texts explicitly substantiate how insular and spiteful communities can manifest violence amongst individuals. These texts also examine how judgment and presumption can lead to barbaric consequences. Furthermore, Miller and Ham consider how in noxious communities, secrets can lead to violent acts in order to expose or confine the reputations of characters. This is an example of a good introduction because it talks thematically. It talks based off ideas and it doesn't particularly say this happened or that happened. This is the difference between an essay that's going to get a C and an essay that's going to score in the A to A+ range. Similarly with the body paragraph, and I'm not going to read this whole thing out to you again, it's important that you continually follow that similar structure, where you open the paragraph talking about the idea. So Miller and Ham depict insular communities where violent acts are used to expose or confine secrets. And we can see that at the very end of this paragraph as well with the linking sentence. As such, both the Crucible and the Dressmaker expose the tragic and painful consequences of keeping secrets. We keep coming back to that idea, secrets, violence, small communities. There are other things that are good about this paragraph as well. Once you've had a bit of a pause and read through it, you'll notice that in green, there are many points where this person contrasts and compares the text. It's important that you just don't say what happened in one text and then lead into the next. Keep saying things like in Salem and Dungata, unlike the Crucible, both couples or both texts, depending on what you're talking about. So it's important that you do that throughout because this is comparison of these ideas. Things aren't the same, they are similar. They are also different. I've also highlighted for you there the use of quotes. It's really important that you have evidence when you're discussing these ideas, concepts, and themes. You will have to justify your interpretation of the text. In blue, I've highlighted some interesting language which you might like to use. Repressive communities. An overview of this topic. So repressive communities force characters to hide, question, or can potentially see people openly display their true identities and values. In both texts, the rigid beliefs of the communities either force characters to hide their true identities or can lead to them ultimately showing themselves. Again, we'll need to go through some of the different points in relation to repression before you can discuss it and find examples. So sometimes we have varying motives for hiding our true selves. Maybe because of the community we are in, we are afraid of being punished or afraid of being excluded or feeling different or being an outcast. It could be feelings such as disappointing others, which force you to convey a different image to the outside world. Your own feelings of being embarrassed or feeling guilty could lead to you hiding either your own secret or who you are. Similarly, there are consequences for hiding your true self or hiding secrets. Sometimes it leads you to be able to empathize more with outsiders. So because you are hiding or you are hiding something, you can feel for others who do the same. It can also have the opposite effect, where people are less likely to empathize with you because you are excluded. It also leads to people being more likely to conform to the rules, because society has this social code, and if you are not upholding those expectations, you are going to be punished or excluded. So we do see more and more people just conforming for the sake of it. But it can also lead to people becoming bitter for having to repress yourself or to hide an ongoing secret. This can become quite traumatic and can result in these feelings of bitterness. Here are some examples from the Dressmaker. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but you can pause the screen and have a look. There are some characters that you're probably aware of, but some that you can use as alternate examples. You have Sgt Farah there, who is quite obvious. So what causes this character to hide their identity? Sgt Farah was extremely feminine and liked to cross-dress. However, because Dungatar is a fairly traditional and conservative town, it is likely his true identity would have been seen as wrong, and he is worried about being excluded or losing respect and power in the town. It allows Sgt Farah to empathise more with outsiders such as Tilly, Molly and Teddy, and share some of the same feelings. We know that this small community was not accepting of different people at the time. They were very close-minded and stuck to traditional values. The town of Dungatar and society of the time focused on ingrained social order, and when it has been disrupted, society would treat them as an outcast. It is interesting to note that Sgt Farah does say at one point that the townspeople must have seen what was on his washing line throughout the years. So those hidings of secrets and those whisperings are something to also consider. Other examples that you could turn to include Irma Almanac. So she is the wife of Mr. Almanac, the town's chemist, who was abused by her husband over the course of their marriage. She is also deprived of any medication for her arthritis because Mr. Almanac believes her pain is the result of sin. And he ongoingly abuses her in this manner, even once he is physically unable to abuse her. By not telling anyone about this abuse, it continues to happen. Afraid to tell anyone because of the way it would look or the reputation or the stigma around domestic violence at the time, we can see that Irma does not confide in anyone besides Molly. Again, we can see outsiders grouping together. This shows the power imbalance at the time, where men had significant power over the women in their household. Mr. Almanac is likely to get away with this due to his role in the community and his gender. Other examples you may wish to talk about include Pearl and her affair, Nancy and Ruth and their homosexual relationship, Evan and his illegal activities and sexual abuse, and lastly, Leslie. So Leslie is the equestrian looking for work and is employed at the Beaumonts. He is gay but falsely pretends to be straight and marries Mona. So Leslie tries to conform but cannot commit to a sexual relationship post-marriage. As a result, Mona finds out but chooses to stay. Again, think about the era of the time, the role of marriage, men and women, divorce, all of those types of things would have played through Mona's mind. So in 20th century rural Australia, it was the norm to be considered heterosexual and to repress a homosexual identity. In this era, it would have been considered embarrassing or shameful, Even for Mona, if she were to leave, Leslie would feel some of those emotions. You'll also need to have examples from the Crucible of repressed identities and different secrets. Before I begin, it's important to remember that this was a Puritan community. So they are members of a quite religious group that broke apart from England in the 16th and 17th centuries. They took a simplified and strict view on religion, and they emphasised moral behaviour and forbid many pleasures. So as such, what we would consider quite insignificant acts of insubordination are actually very significant. Some of the examples you may choose to talk about include when Abigail lies to Reverend Paris about why she was dismissed from the Proctor's household. She knows that the truth of an affair would have ruined her reputation. She's the niece of a Puritan minister, and in the 1600s, the prospect of having sex before marriage was a sin that would have seen her outcast from society as soiled goods. She continues this fabrication, so Abigail lies to Paris about dancing in the woods because she endeavours to conceal the dancing because she was putting a curse on Goody Proctor. This act would also expose her true intention of being with John Proctor and her past sins. Again, this directly opposes the town's Puritan faith, thus meaning she would receive harsh punishment for insubordination as she had sex before marriage and also lied about it. Now, Abby's not the only person lying in this text, so the girls pretend to be possessed rather than telling the truth about the dancing in the woods. Initially, the fear of repercussions for having Paris find them and taking part in these witchcraft activities with Tituba in the woods fuels them to do this. However, Abigail then threatens physical violence on the girls if they don't follow her lead. They would also want their names to be considered entirely white in the town, and being found out for the dancing in the woods would ruin their reputation. Moreover, we have John Proctor. So he's initially reluctant to go to the courts to tell the truth about Abigail because he does not want the truth of the affair with Abigail to come out because it will ruin his family's name and bring considerable shame. He also knows what Abigail and the group of girls are capable of. He really does not want to confess to the adultery that he and Abigail had in the past. This is further compounded with Elizabeth, and Elizabeth lies to the court about Proctor's adultery because she's trying to protect his reputation and his pride. It's important to note adultery is considered a sin in the Puritan belief system, and this would bring great shame. She also wants to be a good wife, and she essentially purges herself on the stand to avoid confessing her husband's sin. This is all brought to the forefront when Proctor decides he does not want to sign the confession because he accepts that his afterlife is already stained by his affair with Abigail. As such, he chooses to keep his legacy pure and his children's future reputable without the stain of his untrue confession as well. So lots of dirty little secrets there for the townspeople in Salem. What you'll need to do is, while we can bring up many similarities, we must also find that contrast. So not all characters hide their identities. In both texts, there are characters who publicly display their true values and identities. But again, you've got to look for the differences between all of them. You need to consider why they reveal themselves, their family upbringing, their personality, their personal sense of justice, their religious values, or their true sense of self. We have Teddy. So Teddy demonstrates his true values through his close relationship with Tilly Dunnage. He is not afraid to show this. Despite both being considered outcasts, they show up to the footballers' dance as a couple, ignoring the social ramifications, remembering that Teddy, although from a very low socioeconomic family, is liked by the people of Dungata. In his final display of rebellion to the normalities, he jumps into the silo in an attempt to show his affection and love for Tilly without care of possible repercussions. However, he unfortunately meets his end as he suffocates. We also have in comparison Giles Corey. So Giles Corey also displays his true values. He, very much like Teddy, sticks to his morals and aims to protect those around him. He is crushed to death, showing integrity. Also from the Crucible, we could talk about Rebecca Nurse. So Rebecca Nurse dies after being accused of witchcraft. We know that if she doesn't confess that she will be hung. Essentially, she refuses to confess due to her honour, her dignity, and her belief in God. She does not want to consider the sin of committing to witchcraft and saying that she's done something. So it's lying, but it's also lying about compacting with the devil. And so she would rather die a good Christian woman than to commit sin to save herself. We then have our two protagonists, which you could also talk about. Remember that they do show change over the course of the text. We can look at Tilly and her unique fashion choices, which reflect her time living in Europe. When she moves back to Dungata, she continues to wear the handmade outfits, displaying them proudly, despite them being considered sexualized and scandalous. In other ways, we can also see Tilly repressing herself. So this is an interesting contrast. Likewise, John Proctor shows off his true colours during his interactions with the courts. He attempts to demonstrate to the townsfolk that the events that have taken place in Salem are nothing more than child's play. He is very frustrated by the court's inability to process that this is not witchcraft. As such, we see him finally standing up for his true self, exposing his sins in order to try and bring about this idea of injustice. Again, let's have a look at another essay topic. This time it's an essay topic with a quote attached. Sometimes you'll get one quote, or you might get two quotes, one from each text, but it's important that you do relate to this stimulus. There are some secret ideas, concepts, or themes hidden in this quote that you will have to discuss along with the rest of the prompt. So the quote says, "You can't keep anything a secret here. Everyone knows everything about everyone, but no one ever tittle-tattles because then someone will talk on them. Compare how fear controls the identities and characters in the Dressmaker and the Crucible." So immediately with my highlighter, I would go through and highlight the key words in the quote, but also the key words in the questions. So we're talking about how fear of perhaps being exposed or excluded or being punished forces the people in the Dressmaker or the Crucible to hide their true selves. But also looking at the quote, it's about secrets. So hiding identities and hiding secrets. This person has broken it down into three clear ideas, remembering that we want to have topic sentences that talk about the idea, the concept, or the theme, and not the character and the plot. I'll let you pause here and have a look at some of these examples, remembering that the topic sentence is more important than the evidence below. You may wish to use this as a plan for something for you to practice with. So for paragraph 1, you could write, "Anticipation of punishment influences people's actions and forces them to conform to social norms and falsify their identities." So this first paragraph is about punishment. It talks about Abigail Williams and Tilly Dunnage and their ongoing punishment. I've also included the page numbers, so if you want to go and find some good quotes to have a go at writing this paragraph, you can. The second paragraph will be about the fear of being excluded from religiously rigid societies. So talking about Sgt Farah and the Proctors. And then lastly, despite the consequences, there are those who remain true to themselves. So remembering these ideas are complex. You need to try and show some challenge to these ideas where possible. So don't always fully agree with the prompt. It's important to see how these ideas are complex. So there are those people who remain true to themselves, such as Rebecca Nurse and Teddy, that you could also discuss. This brings us to our last theme of social status. So characters in these texts seek to maintain or advance their status in the hierarchies that dominate the communities. Both communities of Salem and Dungata are governed by a power structure, which characters seek to maintain, or at times they break. You should compare and contrast once again the nature of these power structures and the means by which people will try to hold on to power and the impact of this. So we know already that Salem is a very religious town. It's dominated by Puritan beliefs, and that the court system upholds that as well. Dungata is a little bit different. While we can accept that in Australia's rural 1950s that Catholicism or Christianity would have been the predominant religion, we don't see an open church in Dungata. We don't see people gathering openly and talking about many religious quotes, apart from Mr. Almanac, really. But they do have their own social code, which is built upon the beliefs of Christianity. So do try to make sure that you don't kind of do this comparison based off religion almost, that you need to look at the social status and the social hierarchy. Now here is a kind of really brief outline of the different characters in the text, looking at who has power, who's looking for power, and potentially people who are powerless. So we've got a few people in the Crucible who we would consider powerful. So Reverend Paris and the judges, so Judge Hathorn and Deputy Governor Danforth, all hold high social status in these texts. So Reverend Paris as the religious leader of this community, but also the judges for their official roles in the court. There are characters who seek power. So Abigail Williams enjoys the feeling of power and knows that she can accuse others. And we can also look at Thomas Putnam and the way he tries to gain power over people's land. Over the course of the text, we see some more complex characters. So John Proctor is clearly an outsider. His lack of Puritan beliefs and his ability to try and overthrow the court is evident. But we also see over the course of the text Reverend Hale change from someone who was initially with the courts to someone who is in contempt of court. However, in this text, there are also plenty of people with no power at all. So looking at Sarah Good and Goody Osborne, Mary Warren and Tituba, different characters who for different reasons, be it their gender, their race, their standing within the community, they do not have the power to change their fates. We can also see this contrast in the Dressmaker. For different reasons, there are powerful people. So Mr. Almanac is the town's only chemist, inflicts pain and suffering and controls people's medications. Elspeth Beaumont with her finances, or her perceived finances, as well as Evan Pettyman in the role as town councillor. Essentially, these people abuse and manipulate the people under their control. We can see the rise of Gertrude, or Trudy, who seeks power after marrying William, and the way that she tries to climb up that ladder of success. Our outsiders are quite clear, with Tilly Dunnage and Teddy both being on the outside. So Teddy is quite a complex character because he does have some power as a football player. The community see that he has some value to them, but at the end of the day, he's still a McSweeney, and due to his outcast nature, they do not accept him fully. Tilly, on the other hand, is a complete outcast. We can also see the physical representation of the way they are excluded. So both characters living on the outskirts of town, Molly's house in particular, right up the top of the hill next to the tip, shows that real outsider image. So once you've identified some examples you can use, it's important that you again come back to those big ideas when unpacking a topic. The last topic is to protect themselves, the powerful must crush the powerless. So the first thing I start doing is start looking for those big ideas. I highlight the key words, protect, powerful, and crush. And I go and I find some synonyms to start opening up this topic. So protect means save, or maybe self-interest, or prevent self-harm. Power means authority or superior. Crushing means destroy, hurt, inflict pain. And from there I can start to unpack and ask questions. So who protects themselves in these texts and why? Or when do powerful people hurt others and why? We can see here a different form of planning. So this person's used a table rather than colourful subheadings. And any way you'd like to draw up your plans is completely fine. So paragraph 1, so those in authorities act to save their personal reputations by inflicting pain on others. Paragraph 2 will be about, at times, people with power act not in self-defence but in acts of revenge. And then lastly, sometimes power can lead not to the crushing of the powerless but the sacrifice of self. So we've pulled that apart and come up with 3 different ideas. So one about personal reputations, one's about revenge, and the other about self-sacrifice. Below that, the evidence is stored, and of course the evidence is important, but the main point that I'm making in this video today is it is the idea, the concept, or the theme that is most prevalent. If you're really struggling, but you want to have a go at writing something, here's a template that looks at to seal. It's color-coded, it gives you a sentence starter to get started. So if you want to have a go at writing a paragraph, you may wish to use this to help scaffold your writing. Again, keep coming back to the main idea of this paragraph. Using this extract from the plan, the main idea of this paragraph is that people in authority act to save their personal reputations, and they do this by inflicting pain on others. So remember, when you're explaining the evidence about Danforth or you're explaining the evidence about Evan, you keep coming back to this idea that they're saving their reputations by hurting others. Otherwise, you end up just kind of telling us what happened in the text and not answering the question. I'll pause here so you can have a look at that content. Here's an example, and this one covers, I think, what was paragraph 2. So if you want to have a go at that first paragraph, you can compare it and contrast it here. No, that's actually on paragraph 1, that's okay. So once you've had a go at writing your own, you may wish to have a look at this one, which really explores the different ways that the characters are powerful, but also that they inflict pain. The last thing that may be of interest is that once you've written your paragraph and you're comparing it, it's important that you look at the amount of explanation. So the explanation is in green, and the topic sentences are in yellow and the linking sentence in yellow. So these are all the ideas, concepts, and themes, with very little evidence being the pink sections and your comparison starting to come across in the blue. Yes, this is a complex area of study, but if you follow the formula of topic sentence, which covers the idea, evidence, explanation, which explains the idea, compare, example, a final explanation which covers the idea again and linking back to the whole overarching idea, that you are certainly on the right track. I hope you found today's lecture very insightful. Please remember that you can go back and pause on any slides to have a look at that writing or screenshot any of the examples to assist you in the future. Good luck with your future studies and all the best on the SAC.